Welcome to the Career Composing Podcast, live stream number 5. Everyone's career is like a musical composition, with your experience, talents, and dreams acting as the notes that drive the music. We want to help you use your skills to compose a refreshing career path. Share your experience, hear from others, and let's together discuss your outlook and how it can change for the better. Today we have our first of what we hope to be many interviews with professionals to discuss their careers, industries, and businesses to help our audience get a feel for what careers in different fields look like and how people can translate their experience and skills into a new career path or a different career path. Our guest today is Ryan Zaleski, Director of Software Engineering at TechDynamism, a technology firm based in Charlottesville, Virginia. He has worked in the tech industry for 18 years, doing everything from network administration and help desk to software development and systems design. Ryan, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So to kick things off, can you give us an overview of your career journey into the software field?
Sure. So really my interest in computers and software development started at a relatively young age. So when I was a kid, I built my first computer with my dad. I got introduced to programming because I picked up one of his old college textbooks on GW Basic and started getting into the programming field. I was really amazed at how you could write something and kind of manipulate it and really build something just by typing software commands and things like that. And so that really sparked a passion. So my journey is a little bit different, I think, than the standard in that I actually started working as a software developer and doing network administration while I was going to college the same time. But really to follow the path of what I took, I started off in tech support and help desk, and I did a little bit of computer repair for side jobs. And that kind of got my foot in the door. Then I started getting into more professional activities, so working as a network administrator for a corporation. From there, I got exposed to some programming and building some simple web apps. And that kind of sparked my interest there of software development. From there, I've done everything from doing contract work to working for large and small corporations and kind of everything in between. Worked as a software developer both remotely and on site, which we can kind of dig into a bit later if you're interested. And then eventually, after kind of going through the courses in programming, I went and started working on higher level things like architecture, systems design, worked as a software development lead, and then ultimately where I am now as a director of software engineering.
Okay, well, great. I appreciate you sharing that really at a high level. And so following on that with, I guess, the general topic of programming, what would you say are some on-ramps or pathways that people could take to get into that field?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a lot of different ways to get in a field nowadays. There is definitely the traditional approach, going to college. And so, signing up for a university, whether it's a kind of 2-year community college or it's, anything larger like 4-year plus university, really what they try to do is they try to build a foundation for you. So you're learning more of the patterns behind things, like why are you writing software in this way? Why is it more optimized if you kind of write this kind of search versus this kind of search? And so those kind of skills you can apply to a broad range of technologies, problems, things like that. So I really will stress that's like the theoretical foundation for a lot of software development. But with that being said, not everybody has the resources, whether it's time or money, to go to a 2 to 4 year degree and kind of wait that period to get into the field. So if you're looking at some options to kind of shortcut that, a lot of times now you'll see boot camps around. So a lot of the boot camps are set in place to have you learn a specific technology. So whether it's like a Ruby on Rails boot camp or an Angular boot camp or something like that, to get you in the door for a job. And for example, I know at TechDynamism, we've had people that are interested in getting in software development, reach out to us and say, how can I start working with you? And a lot of times we'll recommend go to this boot camp get some experience, get some of that fundamental knowledge, and then we can start you on the track of like a junior developer. You can kind of work your way up through the system. So with those, you typically learn more of the how to do something as opposed to the why. So again, the college is like the why, the theory behind things. The boot camp is more the how. Like when I, write this kind of style of code, it does this kind of thing. So those are two, common paths I've seen. Another one, which is kind of related to both of them, is moonlighting or doing kind of gig work. You see a lot nowadays about the gig economy. There are sites out there. Older ones out there are like Rent-A-Coder, but more modern ones are like Upwork and Freelancer, where a lot of times people will post a project and you can, bid on that project and work on it effectively as an independent contractor. And that's another good way to kind of test the waters. So maybe you've attended a boot camp, you've got enough experience to know how to do, the basics of something, and you want to, see, what it's like to actually work on a real project. That's a good way to get in the door without making that full commitment. So I know like you've spoken about like changing careers. So maybe you're in a certain career, like I don't know, say you're working as in the healthcare industry, but you really want to get into tech. Well, maybe going to a boot camp and trying a couple of like side contracts is a good way to test the water, like say on the weekends or at nights, to see if it's really something for you. So that's one good option.
Now, regarding types of programmers then, so you have the various boot camps in college programs that can certainly, share elements to that, but there are, I only call them maybe different flavors of programmers. If you could break that down for me.
Yeah, Scott Hanselman, he works for Microsoft. He has a good kind of funny article out there. It's quite old at this point, but if you search for it, it's a coder, a programmer, and a hacker, developer, and computer science walk into a Venn diagram. And he kind of lays out where these things overlap and the different skills. The way that I boil that down is there's really three kinds of developers that I've seen. One is the computer scientist, right, who is really interested in optimizing things, the theory behind everything, how to really kind of get the most bang for your buck out of something, and the theoretical best practice. I see those kind of people working in fields like machine learning, artificial intelligence. They're the ones that are working at Google, at the more kind of intense, tech companies. Another kind of personality type that I've seen out there is what you would call like a hacker. So these are the kind of people that like to tinker with things. So they have various IoT devices in their house. Maybe they set up like smart devices, whether it's like Alexa or a smart fridge or smart controls on their AC units, things like that. So they're really like the tinkerers, and they're more interested in kind of getting things to achieve some kind of goal. So it's less about the theory, more about the output. So I want to get some kind of system so it's up and running and it makes lives easier. Those personalities are actually really good for moonlighting, because a lot of times with like the moonlighting or the contract type positions, you're looking to get something done in a more efficient kind of way. So that's kind of one area. The third and probably the most common, or the biggest slice of the pie, are just general developers, software developers. And the way I describe those is it's kind of a blend between business and tech. So you understand the tech side of things, so both the why and how to build something, but you also understand the business importance. So there's a cost to doing development. There's ROIs on things. There are trade-offs you have to make. Maybe I hold off on doing this feature until this other time because of XYZ reason. So those are the three kind of major categories that I see, and those actually blend themselves decently well with types of corporations or types of companies to work with, I guess is the best way to describe it. So to kind of like dig a little bit deeper on that side, there are three kind of main areas you can work as a software developer. You can be a consultant. You can work on a product, in a startup usually, or you can work for a corporation. And those each have their own feeling and kind of flavors to them. A consultant, you're working in a really high-paced environment. So You might have a new technology that you're working on every month. You might have a new business you're working with, every 6 to 9 months. Um, you're considered to be an expert in the field. So there's a lot of expectations put on you. And you're really kind of at your A game with output and things like that. So if you like a lot of variety in your work, you like a lot of fast paced, a lot of kind of working on cutting edge things, consulting is a good space to be in. Another area, like I mentioned, is product development. So working for a startup company. So this is where you kind of see more of the stereotypical somebody's riding around the office on scooters, like that kind of feel to set the vibe. And these areas, like somebody's working on one product, one kind of application, and they're trying to bring it to market. So as you can imagine, there's a culture around that. So there's a lot of investment in like marketing and getting a user base. You're usually working on the latest tools and technologies because nothing's holding you back from like using the latest and greatest. There are financial considerations there. A lot of times you might work with them and might accept equity as a form of payment, either partial or fully. Usually the culture is a bit more like hip and a little bit more kind of on that area in that space. And so that's good if you're kind of interested in working on the latest things. You want to be part of something bigger. You're kind of looking for the next explosion in some kind of tech area. And then the final one is working for a corporation. So corporations, they vary a lot, but compared to consulting and product development, they tend to be a little bit slower paced. So they might be on the leading edge of technology as opposed to the bleeding edge. So not the very, very latest and greatest, but still, modern kind of things that are out there. A lot of the times they're internally focused, these positions, like how can you make internal processes better? So how can the accounting department, communicate better with the sales department or something? And so that is usually a little bit slower paced environment. You have a little bit more job stability, right? Because say with product development, if the startup busts, you're looking for a new job. With consulting, if you don't have that next client, you might be looking for a new job. Usually corporations have a longer kind of runway in that perspective. So, to kind of, summarize, if you're looking for more security, you're not really super interested in the latest and greatest technologies, and you're looking for kind of the long term, go with corporate. If you want to do, high paced, a lot of different technologies, being an expert, I would say look into consulting. And then if you want like, culture, being part of something bigger, that kind of thing, being product development. That's kind of how I break those things down.
No, I appreciate you unpacking that for us. Would you say, to pause for a moment on this not pause, but really dig in further, would you say there is a certain, depending on the personality, a certain way of kind of mapping those out? So for instance, someone wants to go in the software field, working for a small startup that's developing some software product could be an option because you get so much exposure to the full stack potentially. But then as they're there, they're like, I really like this environment, but I want more security. So they go to a corporation and they're like, you know what, this isn't as fast paced as I want. Then they'll jump into consulting. So I'm not saying that each person will experience all three, but it's more of, do you see that as somewhat of a narrative in some cases where it's really finding out what kind of pace you're interested in doing?
Mm-hmm. I think definitely the pace is really the big factor. Pace and technology. Corporate, it tends to be a bit more, they'll invest in you to learn the thing that you have to learn for the corporation. But it is kind of like, if you're interested in like a job that's like 9 to 5, then I can kind of more or less not have to worry as much about it until the next day. Then corporate is usually like a bit better of an environment. Product development is, maybe you don't want to learn a lot of different languages and a lot of different techniques. You want to focus on one and get really good at it. That's, within the product development. Again, consulting is like, the kind of person who really loves learning new things. You love the challenge of kind of expanding your mindset to continually work into new areas.
Okay. So I guess then transitioning from that, you've been in, as mentioned in the intro, been in the tech world for about 18 years.
Mm-hmm.
And this is more of like what you wish you knew back when you started, or maybe ones that you've heard from other people where like, I wish I knew this back when I started this, so that people understood that it's not a race to get to senior software engineer within a year or two, because that's just pretty much unrealistic depending on, I'd say, most companies that I've seen. But like, what would be some of those, the wish you knew back when you were starting, or maybe, 10 years ago about the software field in general?
Yeah, some things that I see that maybe people miss, whether it's due to like cultural kind of stereotypes or just lack of knowledge of the field, um, are, for example, teamwork. So a lot of times we have this like thing in our mind, right? Like of a programmer in the basement eating Doritos and Mountain Dew, kind of hacking on a computer, right? But in reality, it doesn't really work a lot of times that way. There's a lot of teamwork. You might be working with a business user to decide what is the best way to show something on the screen. You might be working with an architect to talk about like what are the other downstream implications of it, or working with someone that's testing your code to make sure they understand how to kind of stress it. So there's a lot of collaboration, and so I think maybe at one point in time in history it was very like kind of working remote and being isolated and just get the thing done. But now there's a lot of teamwork and collaboration. So if you enjoy working with other people, don't think that like programming is limiting in that aspect. It's definitely not. Another area is the continual learning, right? So with a lot of fields, you go to college, you learn how to do something, and there's relatively minor change. You could take, things that are a little bit slower moving, like accounting, for example. Unless laws are changing, like tax laws regularly change, but in general, accounting principles of like balance sheets and things like that are relatively stable or slower moving than software development. So within software development, I think at this point, the rough estimates are there are 700 programming languages.
Mm.
And even if you discount the ones that are not being used, there's probably around about 250 that are actively used in some aspect. That's a lot. That's a lot to learn and remember. And with that being said, new things are always coming up because there's always new ways to do things. Like think about even in our kind of lifetimes, mobile apps weren't a thing at some point. Mobile phones weren't a certain thing at some point. So, the landscape changes. So definitely, if you're going to get into software development, just realize it'll be continually learning. And I think it's a positive thing, but you definitely have to enjoy kind of, getting up to speed on stuff.
Well, there was one, a past conversation you and I have had. There was a language that has become more popular the last few years, where you didn't have to like unlearn previous programming languages, but it was a very different way of kind of looking at it and organizing your thought. I'm going blank on which language it is, but just it's certainly, you've learned one or two languages. There's an idea, syntax that you have that could kind of translate back and forth. But to your point, that could just be recreating from scratch something because it will have higher efficiencies in whatever the goal is.
Right. Yeah. There's both like changes in the way things are done. So, go back a few years, a lot of the kind of rendering of websites, to kind of speak a little bit broadly, was done on the server and it was sent off to the client. Now with, phones and computers being so powerful, a lot of that stuff is offloaded to, the user. So like things like, running stuff in JavaScript in the browser on the client machine, like those things are happening. So those shifts happen due to technological changes or behind the scenes. But there's also just kind of better ways to do things. So I think maybe the technology we were talking about was the shift between AngularJS and Angular. So a lot of people got on board with Angular, which is a client-side JavaScript and TypeScript-based framework. Um, so a lot of people started writing apps in AngularJS, and Google kind of owns that framework, or kind of champions that framework, is for the best term. And they decided to completely rewrite it and change the way that you interact with it. And so that's where Angular came out. So there's no JS on the end of it. And so in order to upgrade, it's actually like a rewrite of your app. It's not just like kind of tweaking a couple little things. So in that case, like a company is kind of changing, your approach to software development because they're forcing that change, so to speak. So there's a lot of different influencers and how you kind of get new languages and techniques, but that's the landscape that's out there. So.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you going through that. And I'm trying to think, it was AngularJS or Angular or something else, but I'm going blank on what it we'll just go with that because I think it was close to it. One thing I didn't want to acknowledge those who are viewing this, that there is some video lag going on. And so just with the audio and video, there's a lag there. So it is nothing, I don't know if just issue we have as far as connection, but just wanted to acknowledge that. Regarding some listeners maybe out there trying to figure out, do I have what it takes to become, a programmer? What are kind of some small attempts at doing that? So my biology professor mentioned that, how do you eat a hamburger? He then responded to this own question of, one bite at a time. Is there someone out there who maybe really want to explore this or is thinking about exploring it to have that small little bite? Like, is there not specifically like a resource per se, but maybe something they could look at to like, I'm trying this out. And it's kind of like having some training wheels on riding a bike. Do you have any suggestions or stories that you've heard where this person tried this and then kind of progressed in on it? So like a really kind of not easier, but like a different way of approaching it, so that do people even have the idea or the ability to like think database wise or data flow, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, and there are definitely, by the way, like some skills or things that I think developers should have, which we can definitely go over as well. But there are like, inlets to this to software development. I think that the best way I've seen people work on these kind of things are pick something that you want to do, like something you want to create, whether it's a website or an app or something like that, and start going down that path of creating it, because in that case there's no barriers, right? You don't need a job. You don't need any kind of funds nowadays because there's a lot of free resources out there. So maybe you're really passionate about, I don't know, cars, and you want to create a website that showcases different cars, the models, maybe some kind of like database of like what features are included, things like that. And so that will kind of combine like a passion you have or an interest you have with maybe programming. And so that is usually a good driver for motivation. So that's kind of one area. I also would say that it might be useful to trim down as much as possible. So instead of thinking, I'm going to have this website with this backend API and this database, and it's going to go to this search appliance, and it's going to send notifications to your phone, like cut out all of that stuff. Just do it as basic as possible, especially if you're learning. So maybe if you're learning, you really just create a simple app that is storing information in memory, just as like a playground, some spot where you're just learning the framework. That way you're not worrying about a database, you're not worrying about an API, you're just learning, in this example, maybe how Angular works or something. And so kind of setting your focus will help a lot in that case.
Okay, to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about maybe some core skills that someone has that are, let's say, basic building blocks to it. So it could be, again, the way you think, it could be the way you process information. What would you say are some of those core skills that you could use as building blocks to get into, again, programming? So it's, again, you have high fluency for picking up languages, or that you understand how things connect?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of different skills that show like a successful developer, both from an interest standpoint, but also how can you be successful in a career. Um, from the interest standpoint, I think all developers have like an inquisitive nature. So these are the kind of kids that enjoy doing puzzles.
Mm.
Like I remember, for example, logic puzzles, if you remember in like, was that middle school, where like, Sally is, wearing a green shirt and Johnny is on the second seat of the bus and, et cetera. Like you're kind of putting these pieces together. Um, those people are really energized by that problem solving kind of aspect. So that's one trait, is being inquisitive. Um, the other is being like a systems thinker, or systems builder. So you enjoy like many moving parts and connecting the dots between them, like breaking stuff down. So these are the people that are like, well, how does this, how does a TV work? How does, what are the components of a car to make it move? They're really taking like this complex system and breaking it down to the parts, or maybe taking the parts and building it up to a complex system. Um, these are, useful because you'll do that in software development. You'll think about like a business problem. You'll break it down to small parts, build it back up, and decide what is the best way to kind of move forward. I think there's a certain aspect, to counter my earlier point of being self-reliant and somewhat of like an introvert, because there are times when you have to heads down program, like you're sitting at your desk, pumping out code or thinking or staring at the wall, thinking about what the best solution is. So there is some time where you're by yourself. So that has to be a skill that you enjoy. Being meticulous is also important. So because there's a lot of moving parts and because we're not perfect, software is going to have bugs and it's going to have, weak spots and things like that. So the more meticulous you are, the less those things will come out, and affect people adversely. And then I think, the last thing that I think a lot of people probably miss that's really important is like professionalism. And obviously this is important in almost any career, but as a developer, you're kind of acting as a translator between technologies and, business ideas. So a company, might say, oh, I want this, to perform in this amount of time or to do this kind of feature. And it's your job to explain to them, if that's a complex idea, how much it might cost, where it might break down, where it doesn't quite translate the technical area. So you're really acting as a translator there. And then in the same vein of professionalism, having proper communication, being able to document your ideas, manage your time. These are all things that are successful for, I think, any career. But, as developers tend to be a bit more kind of introverted, a bit more systems thinkers, you have to kind of pull back into that, kind of management side and help organize yourself to be successful, I think.
And I know that, depending on your comment in regards to the ability to work with a team, I think you had alluded to this earlier, as the product or tech stack you're working on, the more sophisticated it gets to, you're going to have a lot more people you're probably working with, because it's not just these weekend warriors who just, jam through, 50 points of stories. Maybe that's needed at times, but in general, if it gets to that point where it's consistently like that, there seems something's wrong. That either there's too aggressive a timeline, or that there's too many features being promised. And I think to your point, to do this in a systematic way, it's doing this in a consistent manner and allowing the teams and the different parts to work. And I feel that kind of segues into one of my next questions. So maybe people do kind of put the toe in their water. They're like, this doesn't seem to be a fit for me. What are some kind of careers or skill, not skill, I'd say careers or roles outside of programming that they work in concert with the programmers, but they themselves are not a programmer?
Yeah, I think being in the field for a while, you kind of see, people shift either in and out of programming. So um, if you think of like a project team, a lot of those kind of tangential roles, people will shift in and out of at times. So I've seen, programmers go to be a project manager in some cases. Um, and so project manager is, responsible for the overall life of a project that is successful. And so those kind of people are, they enjoy working with other people. They enjoy, creating schedules, timelines, budgets, things like that. So that's, a useful field. So, again, talking about a developer being meticulous, that's one skill that kind of translates to a project manager. So that's, one kind of area. I've seen, help desks and support. So, kind of going in and out of that. Usually the help desk and support area is like an on-ramp to being a developer, because in some companies it used to be where when you first start, you work on bugs, right? So like an intro to the system is you start working on some bugs to learn the system, and you're not really impacting timelines so much. And so that's one way to get into it. And again, these are people that like to troubleshoot. So the system's broken, I type in this thing, it outputs this thing, why is that happening? So they're really kind of digging in, tracing the lines, things like that. A business analyst is another kind of area. So a business analyst has a lot of parallels to a programmer, with the exception of they're not, writing programming in programming languages, but they're still breaking down a system. So they're listening to what a client says, breaking that down, deciding how processes flow, the moving parts, things like that. So the way that I can always describe that role is you're still interested in the system, but you're more interested in interacting with people and less interested in the guts of what it's doing. And then another area is like a quality analyst. So the person that's testing the code. So again, you're still really interested in like, making sure the system's working well and understanding the parts. And you're definitely meticulous, but you like more using the system and finding issues and ways to break it as opposed to writing it. So you can see like they're all kind of related to development with some specialties. And then like, the other area is you can also specialize. So within, development or in technology in general, you can get into like machine learning and artificial intelligence. That's usually a specialty. Usually those are people that are much more into theory. They're kind of like in the math nerd area because they like, models and things like that. And there's other tech roles that I think I've seen developers bounce in and out of. So IT operations, you're basically helping keep systems running. So servers, building servers, scaling servers, things like that. Database administrator, so you're not designing the database, but you're making sure it's performing well and that it's optimized. So people that like to organize information might be a good database administrator. And then there's a new role that's kind of emerging relatively recently, and that's called Devops. And that's kind of a blend between the operations and the development departments. And so they're responsible for taking the code that the developers write and pushing it out to a production environment and fine-tuning that process so there's like minimal downtime, the system's reliable, things like that. So tons of related careers. So if programming is not quite right for you, most likely the reason that got you into programming, one of those tangential careers would be a better fit for you.
Well, I appreciate you sharing about the careers and roles that certainly work together with programmers, but also the various nuances of each one of them. So I appreciate you breaking that down. So with that said, I think this is a great time to kind of wrap up. Ryan, thank you for joining us again today. I think it's been great to look at the software world and kind of unpack it in a manner. And to the audience, those who are viewing or listening to this, if any of you have any questions or like chat further about the career challenges that you're facing, or any questions in general about careers, we'd love to hear them. You feel free to email us at podcast@careercomposing.com. And then we may be able to discuss those even in our upcoming episodes. Thanks for joining the show. With that, have a great rest of your day and keep composing.
Thanks, Nathan.
Thank you.